Kateryna. Welcome to the stage. And I'm so happy to be able to introduce you. So Kateryna, as we've heard before and earlier today, is also from the Ukraine. She's an organizational psychologist, a trainer for the development of emotional intelligence, trust, cooperation, effective communication, and peaceful conflict resolution. Her academic background is in the area of international relations and law as a Master of Science, business with an MBA, and psychology with another Master of Science. And Kateryna is also head of the Public Association International Institute for Integral Development, founder of an educational initiative Empatia Pro, and co-founder of You Integral. We're really looking forward to hearing your perspective. Kateryna, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Christiana. It's always challenging to speak after my husband. He's such a great speaker. But also in general, it is challenging to be a Ukrainian in these times. Besides having this psychologically rich experience of waging a war and dealing with the problems of our own state, we're also expected to overthrow the authoritarian regimes in Russia and Belarus, to make sure that the income of an average German wouldn't drop by 80 euro, to contain and assure the emotional safety of Europeans so that they wouldn't feel too guilty or maybe scared, and then to save Africa from hunger, and then to put everything I have to say about it into 20 minutes during IEC. So that's a little bit of a challenge, but I'll try. When in early March I was asked by Benza to keynote at this conference, I was literally fleeing my native country. So we would like to shortly invite you to that day, February 24, and let it experience it together with me. So I woke up at around 4:30 from the heavy explosions. I woke up my household, including the guest of our house, a famous Ukrainian philosopher, Alexander Filonenko. And I started to look at the windows. The problem with our home is that it has the inner yard with the security service of Ukraine. It shares it. So seeing what was happening there, I realized that we need to expect the seizure of governmental buildings. And we have maybe hours, but for sure not days. That was the impression. So I remember this slightly altered state of consciousness. I started to absorb the spirit of my home, smell it. I went to the balcony. I looked at the Vladimirska street, the dome of St. Sophia Cathedral, the Golden Gate. I started to smell the walls of my home. I started to make pictures. My beautiful library with all Ken Wilber's books. The beautiful pictures of integral artist Gaia Orion. And then the Wilbur Combs Lattice. We just had an intellectual club a few days before the war started, and it's Alexander Filonenko calling his wife to Kharkiv. At noon, we were living. We thought, we are just civilians with 6 children. We do not have any military training to be in service. We just put an extra charge on the military. So we thought it's wise to leave. We said bye to Alexander, who actually is lecturing till today from our home. And we were in a few minutes driving by the European Square. And I made this picture. I didn't know for how long the blue-yellow flags will be there. Our next stop was Vinnytsia. my granny firmly refused to leave the country. So we needed to take her there, about 270 kilometers away from Kiev. Same thing happened to me there. Same slightly altered state of consciousness, absorbing the walls, me in the center, 2 years old, and then 16 years old, meeting President Clinton during his last visit to Ukraine in the role of a president, and delivering a speech with him at the Mikhailovsky Square. My children, my parents, we were supposed to spend night there, but we couldn't because of that. Feel it. Watch your bodies. Experience what is happening now. This is a sign that the death is flying above your head and hunting, either you or someone else, but definitely hunting someone. It's also the sign that you need to go to the basement or to the bomb shelter. We didn't know where to go in the foreign city. We didn't know Vinnytsia well, so we decided to take a risk and leave immediately, straight at night. That was one of the most heartbreaking moments in my life. Saying bye to Granny, not knowing whether I will see her again. Still not knowing whether I will see her again. Then there were days in traffic jams and 48 hours in a queue to cross the EU border. But believe me, it still was much, much better than in case of most of my countrymen, mostly sisters. They were living like that. So when we settled in Vilnius, I dedicated my life to 3 things. First, to help the Ukrainian women, children, and even a school from Kharkiv to settle in a safe place. Second, fundraising for Ukraine and coordination of humanitarian support. Every morning, I tune into the network of mutual help, reacting to the urgent needs, not knowing where it will take me in the evening, like really not knowing what ideas and realizations will come up in the end of the day. It may seem to you that this unpaid work is quite unstructured, weird, but actually it's very effective. And that's the way most of my countrymen live now. The third thing that I started to do is to visit gatherings like this one, conferences. Since I am rooted in integral and nonviolent communication, I'm a professional mediator, most of these conferences contain the words peace and dialogue in their title or subtitle, and most of them were called because of the Ukrainian crisis. By the mid-May, I got so frustrated with what I detected in terms of the trend after attending these gatherings that I literally fell ill. I lost my voice. Maybe it was because of virus. Maybe it was because of rage and powerlessness that I felt. And that's what I would like to talk to you now. I want to talk to you about some blind spots that I see in our, because I share it, intellectual, highly spiritual, conscious circles that get together to speak about Ukraine. Usually not knowing much, neither about history, nor about culture, nor about needs, and very often not even inviting or consulting Ukrainians. So there are a few things that I would like you to know. First, the blind spot that I've detected is a historical blind spot. What I notice is that operating the language of integral, stages, quadrants, types, level, etc., it doesn't make you historically informed. So I really suggest to learn some historical facts. Some people think that the war started on February 24th, which is not true. The conflict in general didn't start in 2014. It started much, much earlier. Ukraine has gone through centuries of the Russian oppression and atrocities of the same kind for many, many years. And by the way, the first happened 900 years ago. So what we want you to understand is this war has deeply spiritual and cultural roots. For Putin, it's very complicated to sell the meta-narrative of the great Russia without Kiev, the mother of all Russian cities, as they call it. And the Russian propaganda would convince you that we are brotherly Slavic nations that are so close in our mentality. But in reality, we have a totally different cultural code. And actually, Russians never treated Ukrainians as brothers. So let me give you some facts. In 12th century, Kiev was the fourth largest city in Europe after Constantinople, Palermo, and Thessaloniki. Kiev had about 100,000 inhabitants, while Paris and London have had 50 and 20,000 respectively. Historiographers mentioned about 400 churches and 8 large public markets at the time before it was ruined by Andrei Bogolyubsky and Yuri Dolgoruki, rulers of newly founded Moscow. In 1169, after capturing Kiev, Andrei, the Moscow prince, gave the city for 3 days of looting and plundering for his soldiers. It was accepted to treat cities in this way only when dealing with foreign settlements, until now. Such a practice has never been spread to rule cities under any circumstances. Andrei Bogolyubsky's order showed that for him and his army, Kiev was just as foreign as any German or Polish castle. There was no more mercy towards neither women nor children. In 1708, Ukrainian hetman Mazepa made another attempt to get rid of the Russian yoke by joining the forces of Swedish King Karl XII and lost in the famous Poltava battle. As a result, there was a massacre of Baturin, the capital where hetman Mazepa lived, and about 15,000 people killed, most of them women and children. How they were killed? They packed them into churches and burned them alive. Again, no mercy. Another important page in the history of Ukraine-Russia relations was a full-scale Stalin's multi-million genocide of 1933. From 7 to 10 million of Ukrainians died, more than Jews, by the way, in the Second World War. And this is not to mention centuries of prohibition of Ukrainian language and culture, killings or deportations to Siberia of the Ukrainian intellectual elites. And now, you see Borodyanka, Irpin, Bucha, Mariupol, and some of you are still surprised. We are not surprised. We know that handwriting. And this is definitely not the way brothers are treated. So, not knowing history and context, but trying to act as good people, distancing into meta perspective, not willing to zoom into nuances, but having an action bias, wanting to help while not being able to deal with own frustration and helplessness, calling Ukrainians traumatized and not being able to connect with our rage, encouraging peace, dialogue, and forgiveness so that it finally gets back to normal, is another huge blind spot of so-called conscious circles. I personally see it either as ignorance or as arrogance or a form of spiritual bypassing. So a group of colleagues recently put together a public statement called 7 Points on the War and Dialogue from Ukrainian Mediators and Facilitators. It says that there are maybe several tracks of dialogue and negotiations. The war and political negotiations about the ceasefire and exchange of captures should never stop. But negotiations and dialogue between Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians at other levels are misplaced and untimely. Before the war criminals are punished, before the territorial integrity is restored, before the bully is stopped, calling Ukrainians to dialogue with the aggressor is just another form of violence. It contradicts the principle of no harm and is manipulative in its nature. During this war, I discovered something important about myself. I realized that I can kill. If I need to protect life, I would do it. Do I have hatred? No. I would do it with love. No, literally. With no revenge. With ease in my heart. You can call it with love. So there are a few statements I want you to ponder over. Desperate longing for peace at any price or as soon as possible doesn't always make you noble, wise, good, or mature. Fight is not always pre-modern. Peace is not always post-modern, not to mention integral. Respectively, willingness to fight doesn't make an individual or a group red. Disarmament doesn't lead to peace, more often than not, quite the contrary. Pacifists usually don't stop wars. More often than not, the soldiers do. I'm recalling the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. I want you to understand the essence. What is this war about? And how it relates to each of you. It's not just an existential war that Ukrainians are fighting against Putin to survive and get rid of the centuries-old yoke. It's not just a fight for the rule of law, for freedom, dignity, and democracy. It's a clash of civilizations. Authoritarian versus democratic. Power over versus power with. Horizontal hierarchical structures of volunteers. Open civic society with open mind, heart, and will in Otto Scharmer's terms, against the society that is vertically organized, in its overwhelming majority disempowered, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually numb. It's a war of society with solid self-authoring collective mind, in Bob Keegan's terms, and multiple virtues against a society with impulsive and socialized mind, absorbed by propaganda. One country has opened the heart and soul of Europe, from governments to simple families who host Ukrainian temporarily displaced people in their homes. Integral theory suggests us to grow up, wake up, clean up, and show up. Tell me what could be the better way to really show up than open your house to a woman and a child. Having connected to the Ukrainian fight for democracy, millions of people have found meaning and hope. Ukraine, in its essence, resembles US in the end of 18th century. It has become a world leader on the battle of sense-making, or at least it's becoming. With its outstanding vigor, vitality, and coherence, it is modeling a meta-modern cultural code. While Ukrainian blood is in this very moment nourishing the new sense-making for the whole democratic world, I pray that this sacrifice won't be futile. I want to finish by one thing. I want to celebrate with you that you do not need to physically fight for freedom and dignity. Your ancestors did it for you, but don't take it for granted. Gas is expensive, but freedom is priceless. Poets are visionaries. So I want to finish by a poem by a Belarusian poet, dissident friend. Dmitry Strotsev said, The future will come out of the Ukrainian basement and will close its eyes from light. Remember, you're welcome to Kiev, the capital of freedom. And you can help now. Thank you for your attention.